Thanks, everybody, for being here on an incredibly beautiful
Yes.
day. I got to say thank you to this book festival.
Yes.
This is an amazing event. Thank you for everything you guys do. I'm going to do a super brief plug for the National Association of Black Journalists, which has an event on August 9th, which will be at Union Chapel at 4 p.m. And we are proud that Ground Truth and Report for America are co-hosting this event, but this is about them. This is about their mission. And they have some of the best speakers lined up this side of the book fair. And that is including Jelani Cobb of The New Yorker and Abby Phillip of CNN. And really, I want to just encourage you, they don't have the ad sort of acumen that the book fair does. I don't think it's really well publicized, so I just want to say, please come.
Okay.
What an honor to be on stage with Juliette. So I'm going to augment the bio a tiny bit and say we are neighbors. Yeah. We are colleagues at WGBH. We are fellow travelers in places where there is disaster happening too often, sadly, and friends. Yeah. And I really admire your work. I love your work, and I can't wait to talk to you about this book. I'm also going to add a couple more kudos. One is that NPR named this book the Book of the Week 1 year after it was published. Last week.
We call this my long tail book because it's never it never goes like stale. Like,
also it came out on the edge of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine just was such a focus of energy and needed to be, I think, of thinking. But I think there's so much great work in here that will help us get right of boom on Ukraine.
Thank you. Yes.
So I feel like if we can use this book to talk about Ukraine, maybe we will at the end. But I want to just say congratulations on all the successes in the book, and let's dive in.
Okay.
So I wanted to start off. You are a resident of Cambridge, and so we are really neighbors. And you have this opening to the book that I think is haunting and beautiful, and I'd love to share that scene for those of you who haven't read it.
I feel like,
but also maybe try to hit the big question of why'd you write this book?
Yeah. Now, especially everyone thinks it's a COVID book. It's not. First of all, thank you. It is true. Ditto and all we follow each other on GBH. We both speak for Boston Public Radio, and we're asked to make lists of sort of what we want to talk about, and they'll always be like, "No, Charlie has that." And the implication is Charlie could do it better. You know?
No, I hear all the time. No, Juliette, don't touch that. Juliette's good.
So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. I wrote the book during COVID, but it was this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, which is basically how to think about disasters when they're there's really not random and rare, but they are standard operating procedure. If there were a bumper sticker to the book, it would be, learning to fail safer. In other words, I take the bad thing as a given. I want people to stop bad things from happening. So all of those of you who are trying to, make the earth colder and stop radicalization and cyber attacks, God bless you. I'm going to just assume that we're at what we call the boom, and I'm agnostic about the boom or the devil. And then thinking about ways in which we're learning to fail safer. What you were saying in terms of right a boom, right? We're there. So that's just where my focus is. It's not that and the lessons we can learn from disasters. And I was trying to think of how do I introduce this? And then like all of you, I'm home in March and April of 2020. My work is really intense. I advise public and private institutions on preparedness and response, and working from 6 a.m. till midnight on COVID. The kids are home. One kid comes home. The daughter comes home from college, and the boys are there. So those of you who know Cambridge, or a lot of us are from New England, these houses. Our house was built in 1830, or just rambling houses where there's random walls, and our house had been built in 1830, 1840, and there's walls where there shouldn't be walls and whatever, and it had been a boarding house, and it had been a cafe at one stage, split family, triple family, whatever. So we move in. My husband David Barron is here. We move in as a single family house, and they say, "Oh, So the wall behind the closet on the third floor is a crawl space. So like no one opens up a wall to look at the crawl space. You're like, okay, that crawl space is also on top of the boys' bathroom on the second floor. So fast forward 100 years to my boys, teen boys whose bathroom it is, and there's steam and water and whatever, and they forget to tell me that the fan is broken in the bathroom, and so this 2 weeks later, all the plaster comes off the ceiling. This is now April of 2020. We go, and in the crawl space, it's a bit bigger than crawl space. It's about 10 feet by 4 feet, and there's a single picture, and in the book, there's a picture of it, there's a photo, excuse me, of a man. That's an old school photo. He's leaning against a chair, and it says, "To Annie, love, Charles." So when Twitter was good, people were helpful on Twitter. So I put it on Twitter, and I was like, where is this coming from? There's just a single picture in this. And very quickly, people discovered that it was probably Annie McHugh. They found out where I live. They look at old real estate things online. Annie McHugh had lived there from 1917 to 1919. Or the McHugh family, excuse me. And they were a distinguished family. They went to CRLS, or Cambridge Regional Latin, which is our local high school, or the daughter did. They had a son who died when he was 6. And I go to bed that night thinking, this is so interesting. The McHugh family, there was some room up there, whatever. I do tell my husband to lock the bathroom door, and he's like, really? He's like, you deal with terrorists and hurricanes. I was like, ghosts we don't deal with. Like, it was creepy. It was a little bit creepy. It gets creepier the next morning. David definitely didn't love this part. We did learn that the McHughes had a daughter named Letitia. She was 19, the age of David and mine's eldest, and a daughter at the time. And Letitia had passed away in the house, we learned from newspaper articles. She had passed away in this crawl space on the third floor, which was what was called an infirmary room. Some of you who know about old architecture, there's medical rooms. It's where a woman had children, and hospitals weren't accessible in the way they are now. And she died in the third wave of the Spanish flu in 1919. And here I was 101 years later. In the next pandemic with a 19-year-old daughter in the same house. The McHughes would move out. They would put a door behind that wall. They would close up this crawl space, which was bigger than a crawl space. And it got me thinking. I mean, the sort of, the karma and the weirdness and the connectivity got me thinking about where I was in my own field, which was, these things keep coming, and we can pretend like we're surprised or shocked or why us or can't we stop these things, or we can figure out how we're going to learn to fail safer. And it was that. And so what the book is it's hundreds of years of disasters, rethinking disaster management, disaster response in that sort of fail safer. Like what's the connectivity? What's the connective tissue amongst all these disasters, rather than, this hurricane, that cyber attack, that pandemic. And that connectivity really just struck home, obviously, because the McHughes had lived in that house 101 years before.
That is such a haunting beginning to a book. It's the most unlikely launch.
Yeah.
I think you got to my question, why did you write this? I'm going to ask for a little bit more on that. But before I really get there, I would just say that your framing, I presumed knowledge on this, and I maybe want to pause for a minute because it's so important to understand the book to know what we mean by boom, left of boom, right of boom. For those of you who haven't read the book, it is literally a diagram for understanding how to deal with a crisis. And I think it's really helpful, and I hope we can use it as a great model to go into a couple different things. But I want to be clear. Left of boom
so you're
is
looking
left of the crisis.
I'm looking here. So think of the boom. So I started off in counterterrorism, and then became 2005 was a pivotal year for me. It was Hurricane Katrina. Sort of thinking about, I'm spending all this time. I was in counterterrorism starting about 97. stopping 19 guys from getting on 4 airplanes again, to be crude about it. And then we've lost an American city. It drowned, New Orleans, and 2,000 people. We forget the numbers out of Katrina. Over 2,000 people died, and they didn't die from the hurricane. I mean, very few would drown in that moment. It would be the days later. So I started to think about disaster management differently. So if you look at the screen, so I'm agnostic about the boom or the devil. The boom is any harm that can happen, and we define it. So the book also wants to define words that you think you know, right? So crisis, we throw crisis out all the time, but crisis is actually defined as a disruption to your core capabilities, where your ability to respond is limited. And that's a very important way of thinking about a crisis as compared to like climate change crisis or immigration crisis or whatever. The kinds of things I'm talking about in the book are your runway is short between trying to minimize harm and not. So you think of left of boom is all the things we do to try to stop the bad thing from happening. Then there's the boom or the devil. I'm going to be agnostic about it. I'm sort of done trying to predict. It's all bad. It's all going to happen. And then right of boom is where I try to provide readers agency, right? I mean, it is the harm has happened, and we can learn to fail safer. And then the rest of the chapters are really about what are the 8 common themes of every disaster that essentially get you 80% of the way there.
Right.
And I'm going to measure success. Think of my boom. So we always think left of boom is success, right of boom is failure. Right. Well, let me tell you, that's not going to, there's lots of other ways to measure it. If you actually think of it as an infinity loop, right? It's now your standard operating procedure. Then your measure of success is, can you minimize the harms after on the right side of the boom? And, this is not easy to talk about. It is, a pandemic with 400,000 dead, and a pandemic with 1.1 million dead. I'm not sure what our number is today. Like, neither is good. One is better than the other.
Right. Something I really liked about that framing, very simple concept, but a really good one, is those who are trying to mitigate against right of boom or against the consequences of the crisis cannot afford to be confident.
Yeah.
You have to stay on your toes, you have to stay on edge, and you have to think you're failing all the time because every second counts.
Yeah, it is. So this is the runway concept. I do a lot of advising to public leaders and private sector. So if you have a short runway, that's how I'm defining the crisis, because I teach at a school of public policy. So there's all sorts of public policy problems, right? There is, and you have tools of public policy to solve those problems. You have laws and whatever. In a crisis, you've got, minutes, hours, days, and COVID, we had weeks, right? We had January to March of 2020 were sort of the squandered months. But the crash landing is happening. So your only options are either extend the runway, right? Just try to buy as much time as possible, or be ready for the crash. Right. Those are your only 2 options. And I think conceptually that can help people, because you're just not wishing away the bad thing. You're like, hey, I have agency. And that was important to me. I think I think, I have a role on TV or radio where people don't want to hear me lose my head. Like, it's just like, there's enough people out there that can terrify you. I just sort of think that maybe my job is to try to give people agency about controlling or putting things in context.
Right. Okay. So let's get there. Let's talk about, it feels like the devil is everywhere these days.
Yeah.
There's so many crises to deal with. We have the crises, I think, in our own country, in our own democracy. Of polarization. Yeah. And I think how we dealt with COVID landed in the middle of that crisis, so it compounded the crisis. And I think we're in an incredible moment of crisis in climate change. And I think we lived it this summer. All of us know this feels like the summer that we're never coming back from. This is the summer where we can all get used to the new normal. We had record heat waves across 4 continents. So you had Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North America, the United States. Also, this idea of flooding has been from Vermont to Vietnam. The fires seem to be everywhere, from our West Coast to Australia. We all know this. We read about it every day. It feels like the devil is on the front page every day with climate change. But the question I would ask you is, like, on that beautiful mapping of how we're going to deal with a disaster, it feels like climate change is the slow-moving, very hard to read. Where we are, I would argue, I'd think we're still left of boom. We haven't hit the worst of it. How do you feel about what we can do now left of boom so that we can manage right of boom?
Yeah, and I think that, some of these lessons are, because if I'm thinking of this now as an infinity circle, whatever I'm going to do to prepare for the next boom is going to help, minimize those losses or fail safer. So I mean, there's a couple things that you've got each hurricane, each earthquake, and we can talk about, Fukushima and stuff like that, various things that are happening. But a couple things on the sort of preparedness side. I think we are beginning to revamp our understanding of how to build resilient. And this is going to be very odd to people who, I don't mean it this way, but just like the idea of living with fire seems really weird to a lot of us, but there's actually ways in which you can live with fire. And so if we could begin to steer money, this is my whole disaster management framework. What happens after each disaster, because we think of them as random and rare, is we throw a lot of money to communities, Paradise, California, where I've been, and other places to build back, right? And then sort of like, rather than asking the questions, why did these people die? Why did 100 people die, right? And well, most of them died, about 82 of them, and I study how people die, right? It's like 82 of them died on a single street. Well, that's telling me something, right? It's telling me that street was too narrow. So we can actually begin to build infrastructure that if a car breaks down, you can move it. There's actually, so this is technology. I know this whole, the fact that my career is about the strength of tires, but there's new tires that people living in fire areas can have that so that the tire doesn't burn. There are ways. If you ask me what's the one thing I would want in any crisis, it's what we call situational awareness. It's our capacity to understand what's happening in real time. It's amazing how difficult that can be. It comes from the firefighters' motto, know where your fire is at all times. That's for wildfire firefighters. That is how they die, is that they lose track of the fire. It's actually behind them. So you always want to know where your fire is. So technology gives us time in terms of that runway. It's helping us predict earthquakes. It's helping us deliver resources. It's helping us know when the tsunami's coming. Early alert systems. Those early alert systems are 6 seconds. I grew up in California. 6 seconds during an earthquake gets me from here to, I'm going to find a place, right, to somewhere actually an open space protected in an earthquake. So these are, when I say the runway short, I mean, if I can get 6 seconds, if I can get an hour, if I can get, 3 hours for a hurricane alert. And I think the other piece is public safety, and emergency managers globally are getting a little bit tougher with the public that's not willing to do this. Look, there's limited resources. I always say to audiences like mine, this is not about you, it's about me too. If we're not ready, 72 on you. Think about 72 hours of stuff in your home. That's what we ask people who can't afford it or have the resources. And for those of you wondering what that means, that's 1 gallon of water per person per day. So if you have a family of 5, it's 15 gallons of water. I can make it easy for you. Read the book. And so you think, okay, if you all can be ready, then we can limit public safety resources or focus them on those who don't have that capability. And then that will minimize your harm. So I was telling Charlie a new technique that we use that's used in hurricane evacuations is you're going to get about 5% of your population that won't listen to evacuation orders. Some of those are real. People are afraid to leave their homes, elderly with pets. You have to make sure that, an old person has their cat. That's all they have. Like, you have to make sure that the place can take the shelter will take a cat, But another way that we're doing it is part of evacuation orders now include people showing up at your home and saying, "Hi, we get your freedom. We understand you want to stay home because of freedom, right? But do me a favor. Here's a Sharpie pen. Write your name and social security number on your arm, because we're not coming for 3 days. I'm not going to risk emergency managers, and you have no idea what happens to a body in water. We just want to make sure we can identify you." And the Freedom Caucus gets in their trucks, and but just being a little bit tougher. Like, this is real. I mean, those of you who read my work in the Atlantic, like, I was done talking about misinformation and why people weren't getting vaccines. There's going to be some proportion that you can convince. You remember this, and people were I was for mandated vaccines to get on airplanes in June of 2021, because I was done. I don't need to talk about stuff anymore. Like, it's, in other words, the responsibility had to shift from the vaccinated to the unvaccinated, and then we can talk about why people are unvaccinated. And it's things like that where we just get a little bit tougher about people's responsibility to each other,
right,
and the consequences of what it would mean not to be responsible.
Yeah, and thank you for your leadership on that. You were really way out in front on that. It was really impressive. Those were very interesting days. CNN's coverage was outstanding in that time frame, and you were a big part of that. I want to shift the paradigm a little bit. And I want to talk about what I feel is the devil most present. And the devil most present is climate change.
Yeah.
This is the one that surrounds us every day. And I want you to think about questions you have on this or any other of these devils that you want to talk about. I'm going to make this my last question.
Okay, great.
And then we're going to shift it over to you for questions. So please think about what your question is going to be. But this is a bit of an involved question, so I want you to unpack it. I want to talk about Fukushima, because I think Fukushima presents a disaster. And I think we can arguably say that the tsunami is created by weather patterns that cause extreme weather patterns. So I think we can put it in that bucket of that devil of climate change. But we all remember that the tsunami devastates the nuclear power plant. There is then the release of radiation. It starts tracking towards California. The disaster is suddenly a very global one.
Yes.
But the thing I love in your book that you highlight is that there's actually 2 nuclear power plants.
Yeah. No one knows about the second one.
So there's one we know about. We know that was in crisis, that really broke down.
Yeah.
I want you to talk about the second one, and I want you to talk about this conundrum we are in, which is, yes, nuclear power scares the hell out of those of us who remember Gil Scott-Heron, shut them down?
Yeah.
I grew up with Clamshell Alliance, shut them down. But I actually am wondering now, is nuclear going to be a part of us getting through the equation of climate change?
Absolutely.
So let's take this complex set of equations around the devil now and say, tell us about your view on Fukushima and that second power plant.
So to say something is risky, doesn't move me, right? Of course things are risky. And so the question is, can you set up systems that minimize the harm, or try to stop, and minimize the risks, or what would be the consequences of the harm? And so to just pick up on where Charlie left off, the narrative of Fukushima changed the course of how we're thinking about nuclear energy at the very time when we really should be thinking about nuclear energy. The narrative that this was a natural disaster got Germany out of the nuclear world and led to some of the complications in the war in Ukraine. The Democratic Party here basically abandoned it. We're now back, because I think seeing it. So what happened with Fukushima, and I'll just, we always tell the bad stories. I study disasters because sometimes there's a good story. So I did not know that there was a nuclear facility Okay, so there we
you
go.
go.
On the Fukushima, okay, so Fukushima's built, it convinces, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the concerns with nuclear, obviously given the attacks, Japan builds a nuclear industry around the idea that it's safe. Well, my first chapter is called, get your head around it, basically. Like, this is gonna happen. And so Fukushima, the leadership basically gives the guys, and they're all guys in the facility, almost no training on how to fail safer, right? Here's where you have a risky industry and no authority to act. So that seems bad across the board. Down the street, that we never hear of, Onagawa, is owned by someone who was trained in the West, a company where the leadership's trained in the West. He knows this is a risky industry, and he knows his runway is short. So what would you want to give to the guys, and they're all guys in this case too, give to the guys on the ground when you know your runway is short? You'd want them to train about how to bring down or how to turn off a nuclear facility with just a few moments' notice, and you'd want to give them authority to do so. Okay, so they share an earthquake. Nothing new. In fact, Onagawa is hurt more. I mean, its infrastructure is impacted more. They share a tsunami. Onagawa gets more water than Fukushima. Then Fukushima, the guys see the water coming. They call Tokyo. At one stage, they're on a phone call with the prime minister. They don't know what to do. Radiation leak. Onagawa, they have 4 minutes and 40 seconds. They know what's happening when they see the water. Turn this thing off. They turn it off. No radiation leak. That's the story I want. You don't hear that. How many people knew about this facility? Exactly. You're one person, right? My nuclear scientist. Like, are you actually? So basically, that's the story. I can learn to fail safer because maybe I can't stop the Devil earthquake or the Devil tsunami, but I can assert agency at some stage. And just thinking about that and how our single narrative on Fukushima has changed how we think about nuclear energy as compared to a much more complicated narrative about making things less bad is basically it. So I know I shouldn't be so excited about Fukushima, but there's a different story.
But it's such an illustrative example because I think we all feel doomed by climate change, and we shouldn't. I think it's the worst thing we as journalists do in telling the story of climate change, is to create this narrative that it's a doomsday machine, and it's not. I love this book for mapping out agency, as you put it, and for giving us a way to do that. I want to hear your questions now, and I'm going to kind of slide a sideways one in while you come up. Okay. Please come up to the mics.
Please.
But look, the way we know each other probably the most is terrorism.
Yeah.
Sadly. But this is an issue I've covered really my entire adult life as a journalist, and I was surprised that it's not the focus of the book, and certainly want to hear your thoughts on are we getting right of boom on terrorism, and maybe if any of you have terrorism questions, we will riff right into that.
I wanted to write an all hazards book. I wanted to write, I was talking to someone, I saw, there he is. I was talking about how do you measure risk? We're really bad at it. And weirdly, I spend a lot of time with insurers now. It's a really, they're all obsessed with risk too. So then, but I can tell you something about consequence. So I don't really care if you put a statistical number behind the likelihood of a cyber attack or a zombie attack. I'm just going to assume one or the other is going to happen, right? And what the consequences are. So that's it. So on terrorism, though, incredible successes on the foreign terrorism front, a combination of things. Mm-hmm. And here's where's the connectivity, in terms of disruption. Narrative, as you know, is very important with counterterrorism, or disrupting ISIS, and intolerance by not just the West, but also Arab and Muslim countries for what was happening. So you just got a way of thinking. There's now terrorism in specific countries, as we see in particular, say Israel or elsewhere. But we're not seeing the export of international terrorism like we used to, and that's a variety of reasons for the successes. So our problem, of course, if you just follow the data, is just domestic terrorism. That too, I said in my panel yesterday.
So the threat has shifted. So
totally.
You're never you can't say whether we're right of boom because
Yeah, you're just going to
there's
get
a boom effect
right.
differing.
So how do I measure it? So I always think this always comes up in the book. How do I measure success when I'm just going to good bad doesn't mean anything to me. It's like less bad is my standard. So one way I'm measuring it now with domestic terrorism is to look at what's happening with radicalization in this country and say, well, is it growing or is it not? Those are it either gets bigger or it's smaller. And I actually think the metrics are really good in terms of the disruption to the growth of the violent extremism. Not all Trump supporters are this way, but the violent extremism. Why is that? Because it's harder for them to recruit. They're under scrutiny. It's harder for them to raise money. But the most important thing, I talked about this in the panel yesterday, you know this from ISIS. These groups recruit because of the aura of the win. This is how ISIS tells people, look, we're winning. It's luxury here. They get women to come, and the oath keepers and all those, they don't have the aura. That's why these cases have been so important. And I have a theory. I think that's why is Trump so nervous about this indictment of all three of them? And I think because this is the one in which he's the loser. I mean, in other words, he lost the election, and he thrives off the narrative of the win.
Right.
And it's hard to recruit if you're a loser.
Right. Ironically, they had Oklahoma City as their beginning of their narrative win.
Exactly.
Let's get to your questions here. We can start right here.
And I'll be fast on answers. Hi.
I don't disagree about climate change being a huge issue. So is a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
What can we do on the left side of the boom or on the other side of 2024?
Right now.
Right now.
So a couple. I mean, obviously the vote. And like I'm going to be really direct here. Like, be strategic in also who you're supporting. Like, a liberal Democrat from New York does not need your money, but the Secretary of State in Arizona does, right? So if you are a contributor, think strategically about that. So that's one, is just support democracy, get out there, help, go to other states, all that stuff is a huge election. Where the government, I think, has been successful is these prosecutions. I do think that Jonathan was saying yesterday, the price of engagement for this crap is getting high for these people. They're losing their freedom, they're losing money, they're losing their bar licenses. So keep that up, right? And so don't be afraid, right? And there's this idea like, oh, this is so bad, this will make them matter. Who cares at this stage? Everyone's mad. The question is can we protect the voting process in that regard? And then I know it's hard for people to recognize their role in this, but there's a lot of things that you can do, and to be a little bit careful, like in terms of how do you communicate information that you have? Is it actually accurate? Even if it's from the left, is it actually accurate? Are you engaging family members who may not agree with you on the issues that they may care about? And I'll just end with this. This is where Biden is successful. I was saying yesterday, a lot of the climate mitigation funding is actually coming through the Farm Bill, because he doesn't want to say, here's my climate change bill. He's not going to say that because he's not going to get that passed. Hey, Republicans, here's my farm bill. And those of us who are like, oh, they're such hypocrites and whatever, he doesn't care. He wants to get this money out to protect the farmlands, to protect on mitigation. And part of that is finding those commonalities without insisting that we all talk the same language, I think.
That's really good. We have, I agree. We have 4 questions. I think that's all we're going to have time for, but we're going to get to all
fast.
4. And if
1
you
minute
keep your
each.
questions to 30 seconds and your answers to 1 minute, we're going to get to everybody. Because then we have to be out of here.
Yeah, we've got next.
At what time? At 1:15. Okay.
Here we go.
Over here.
So about Fukushima.
Yes.
There's a terrific Japanese documentary called The Days, and I recommend it. It's a fantastic case study in this interplay between government not wanting to panic the people, the Tokyo Electric Company worried about worried about their stockholders, and the few individuals who are on the ground at Fukushima who actually kept it from being a worse disaster than Chernobyl. So it's a terrific. And I think everybody ought to see it.
Thank you for that. And I'll just add on to that. One of the things that the book is 8 chapters on what you can do. But one of the things that every disaster is cultural too. So one of the things is the guys on the ground, because of a much more hierarchical approval system in Japan, felt very uncomfortable acting without pre-approval. And so what you have to think about is, I always say to people who I train, do your people feel confident in the false positive? Right. In other words, because they're not going to act if they're worried you're going to get mad at them if they're wrong. But chances are you kind of want them to act if they feel that they should.
Question.
As technology gets better and better and more fail-safe, I think we are unconsciously comparing our human abilities to the abilities of a technology.
Yeah.
So your, to me, unique voice about less bad is better is in such a contrast to that, and I would like you to just bring in this idea of the possibility of the unconsciousness of we're comparing ourselves to the machines, and now we're at AI, so we're actually questioning, are the machines going to better us? So whatever you need to say.
No, I will. I'll say one thing about this. So I have, the story has a lot of anecdotes that you can take from, but I'll just be very quick with this one. We study zombies in terms of tabletops and exercises, mostly because they're like a protein threat. Like it's like they sort of, you don't quite know what to do with them. So what zombie? No, this is what I'm going to get to. So the people in my space study zombies, and the reason why is because they're like AI. You have no idea what it is. You have no idea, like you can barely explain it, right? And if you look at the zombie genre from the 50s, 60s, right? It's really uninteresting because the human species always dies. Those of you of a certain age will remember this. It's like, you open the door and you're dead. And it's like, okay, like as if we don't have agency. And one of the interesting things, and I do this as an analogy, is the stuff that our kids are watching, like Last of Us and Walking Dead, all of this zombie. Why is that interesting to us? Because that's second, third generation of the human species living with zombies. In other words, we can adapt too. We always assume the AI can be, or the zombie can be adapt. We can adapt too. And I talk to people about AI and technology in the book, and one guy said, we're like so freaking unsure of ourselves. Like we can adapt because we're the human species. We created duct tape. We're awesome. And I was like, yeah, we are. Duct tape is awesome. So we have the ability to adapt too. And in these debates about AI, we're just like the people who, the killers in the basement, and they say, let me go check out that noise. Like, no, like by the sequel, we know don't go down to the basement. So.
All right, I think we're here, and then you'll have the last question. Yep.
Yeah.
This part I'll make really quick. I live in Vermont.
Yeah.
If you look at all of those end times movies, at the end, the survivors are always trying to get to Vermont.
Yeah, good.
I'm just saying. Quickly, though.
They will adapt to that, too. No, I'm joking.
They've never been to the vineyard, clearly.
Yeah. Quickly, though, my question is about the narrative of a crisis of social trust, distrust of authority, failure of leadership. Give us a historical kind of take on that, and whether, in fact, is this being blown up now, and it's something that's always been there, or is
it has always been there? It is, and sort of the fakery of various narratives of disasters is always, everyone wants to have their own narrative. I will say this, and I talked about it yesterday. You cannot. And this is true. I honestly believe, I'd be curious your opinion, that Donald Trump would be president but for COVID. It is hard to hide a body count, and there are a variety of reasons why that's so, the line and everything else. But people have an expectation of leadership to take responsibility, and in particular in a crisis. So the data is clear from almost every crisis. You'll remember George Bush. I mentioned this yesterday. George Bush was wildly unpopular at the end of his second term. That was not because of Iraq. It was not because of Afghanistan. It was because of Katrina. And I think, and so there is a crisis in terms of information and how we get information. There is a way to deal with it now, and I think the media is getting better. I think they get a lot of crap. I think they are getting better about sandwiching truth and trying to get truth out. There's going to be a core that you're not going to be able to change. But I also think, this is the thing that is really hard to get around, right? Body counts are really hard to get around.
We're at time.
Okay.
He was
Sorry.
not doing a heck of a job, Brownie.
Yes.
Clearly.
Yes.
Really
Quick.
quick question, because
Thank
we
you.
are at time. So we're going to
Sorry.
get your question and maybe a quick
Quick,
answer,
very
and you can
quick.
discuss it
Okay,
after.
good. And I'll be there.
Evidently, U.S. government funding to prevent future pandemics by learning more about the possibilities
Yeah.
thereof was occasioned by George W. Bush's head exploding after he read a book on the 1919 pandemic after 9/11,
Yeah.
and on learning from his staff that the U.S. had nothing in place to deal with such an occasion. Now, he made things happen.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Senator Cory Booker's
Wait, you got to get your question.
all right. Preventing Future Pandemics Act has been languishing.
Yes.
Do you have any comments and suggestions
No,
on
there
how to
should-
make something happen now on these things?
Well,
Is it your book?
No, well, no. So just quickly, I don't think that's a permanent languishing. Like, I think that I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait till after the re-elect. But I think the legislation is very good. But here's I guess I'm making an assumption. But the other thing I want to say is the area where we have gotten good on is what I called the squander months, January to March of 2020, is that situational awareness for the next pandemic. That the globe, including China, are pretty committed to. That we had these 8 weeks. And I don't think we could have stopped a pandemic. But do you remember, like, you're watching Wuhan, and then you're like, oh, those poor people in Italy, fingers crossed, hope it doesn't come here. When are we going to London? And the piece that he was talking about, my first piece for The Atlantic, was March 5th, 2020. And just because I'm in the space, and I was like looking at this, I'm like, everyone is out to lunch. I'm not even a doctor, and it was titled "America, You Have No Idea What's About to Happen." It was like March, and my editor was worried it was too extreme. I was like, trust me, it's not. Yeah. So I think that January, if you look at squander time and time to extend your runway, we are getting better, and that's where WHO is putting money. That's where we're putting money.
That's going to have to do it. I want to end on one note before I thank Juliette, because really, truly, you have given us a roadmap for getting ahead of that really short window we have to respond to crises. I just want to say, look, a lot of the questions you hear are about, like, sort of what can we do? One thing is to recognize something. We are both in media. We are journalists, and journalism is in a full-blown crisis. And this is what I spend my life working on. And I think the secret is going to be on a local level.
Yeah.
Local journalism is where we start to get our country back, because if we get the facts right really locally, we can then knit everything together and start to heal. Report for America, this program we have, that's what we do. August 9th in OB at Union Chapel at 4 p.m. is a chance to hear from National Association of Black Journalists about how important that is. I really want to invite you to come to that. I want to say, Juliette, thank you.
This is
I
great.
want to
you
thank
all.
both
Thank
Charlie
you.
and Juliette. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Juliette will